Dust rose in fine, suffocating clouds beneath the heavy combat boots of the operators from PMC Blade. The sun, which only recently had blazed mercilessly over the scorched earth somewhere in Eastern Europe, now sank toward the horizon, staining the sky in hues of muddy orange. The operation was over. Successfully, if judged by the dry reports destined for command's desk. Brutally, if judged by the scars left upon the land and etched into the memories of those just emerging from the fight. 18 men, now moving as a coordinated silent group toward the extraction point, represented the pinnacle of efficiency for the private military company known as Blade. Each knew his place, his task, his role within this lethal mechanism. Snipers, their eyes accustomed to viewing the world through crosshairs, moved slightly off to the flanks, scanning the perimeter. The medic, whose hands were equally adept at stitching wounds and handling a weapon, walked mid-formation. Tech specialists, capable of reviving any electronics or breaching any door, hauled backpacks laden with gear. The assault troopers, the tip of the spear, brought up the rear, their faces an impassive mask beneath layers of dust and sweat. They were professionals, conditioned to the language of orders, the absence of questions, a reality where morality often yielded to the mission parameters and the contract sum. The return to the Blade PMC base, an unremarkable complex of buildings tucked away on the edge of an industrial zone, was routine. Weapons turn in, gear breakdown, a brief medical check. A ritual that allowed them for a time to wall off the memories of the latest operation. Captain Grayson, the unit leader, hadn't even washed the grime from his face when he was summoned by management. In an office with tinted windows, smelling of expensive air conditioning and the faint aroma of coffee, one of the company directors awaited him. The conversation was brief, all business. A new contract, highly lucrative, from a government client whose identity remained veiled in secrecy. Sensitive, the director called it, and the word hung in the air, carrying undertones of danger and ambiguity. Grayson nodded. Executing such contracts was his job. The briefing wasn't held at the base. He was driven in a car with blacked-out windows to an anonymous office building downtown. The meeting room was sterile, windowless, illuminated by the cold glare of ceiling panels. At the center stood a table, and behind it sat a figure. The man's face was obscured by deep shadow cast by the low brim of a hat, and his voice, when he spoke, was distorted by a modulator into complete unrecognizability. A flat, inflectionless, mechanical sound. This was the agent, the client's liaison. The assignment was laid out with stark clarity. Eliminate a dangerous cult holed up on a remote ranch in Montana. According to the agent, the cult was responsible for a series of brutal ritualistic killings that had shaken the region. The objective required the complete annihilation of the site. Everyone present, no exceptions. The intel provided was strangely scarce. Satellite images of the ranch, displayed on the agent's tablet, were blurry, indistinct, as if taken through a thick haze. Grayson felt a faint chill of professional unease. Too many blank spots. He began asking clarifying questions. What was the nature of the cult? What kind of weaponry did they possess? Precise number of individuals on site? Were there any hostages? The agent deflected direct answers. The modulator voice droned out rehearsed phrases. The objective is complete elimination of the site. Leave no witnesses. Then the agent named the advance payment, already transferred to Blade PMC's accounts. The sum was astronomical, disproportionately large for eliminating a group of fanatics, even armed ones. That was the first distinct red flag, followed quickly by the second, the categorical instruction not to ask questions. Grayson's suspicions intensified, but the contract was signed, the money received. An order was an order. He rose, signaling the information was received. The figure in the shadows didn't move. The Blade unit's preparation for the new operation began immediately. Weapons selection. Standard assault rifles, sidearms, grenades, but also specialized equipment. Latest generation thermal imagers, night vision devices, electronic warfare gear, suppressed weapons for the snipers. Study of the sparse terrain maps provided by the agent, planning the approach route, the assault, the exfiltration. Tension hung heavy in the air, a mixture of combat anticipation and a dull anxiety stemming from the mission's ambiguity. Some operators tried to diffuse the mood with jokes about hunting hippies with flowers, but Grayson remained utterly serious. His intuition, honed by years of service in global hotspots, persistently signaled danger. Too little information. Insertion took place the following night. 2 heavy transport helicopters, stripped of identifying markings, lifted off from a classified airfield and set course for Montana. The flight proceeded under complete radio silence. Below, dark swaths of forest. The occasional lights of farms and small towns drifted past. The operators sat in silence, lost in their thoughts, checking their gear. Grayson stared out the window at the darkness stretching below. The ranch was several miles from the planned landing zone. They faced a trek on foot, through rugged terrain, and an encounter with the unknown, hidden behind the mask of a dangerous cult. The helicopters hovered over a small clearing ringed by dense trees, no more than 20 feet off the ground. The fast rope descent was swift and silent. As the last operator touched down, the choppers, lights off, dissolved into the night sky. 18 men of the Blade unit were left alone in the midst of Montana's wild, untamed wilderness. The air was cool and clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. Under the cloak of night, using natural cover and the contours of the land, the squad began moving toward the target. They moved like shadows, maintaining strict formation and spacing. The surrounding terrain seemed exactly as described. Wild, abandoned, far from civilization. Only the distant howl of a coyote or the rustle of a nocturnal animal in the brush occasionally broke the silence. No signs of human activity were observed on the approach to the ranch. After some time, they reached an overlook offering a view of the ranch. Taking up positions on a hillside concealed in thick undergrowth, the operators deployed their optics and thermal imagers. What they saw provoked more than just surprise in Grayson and his men. It was a jarring dissonance, a stark contradiction to their mission briefing. The ranch looked utterly peaceful. Several neat wooden houses, a large barn, livestock pens, a windmill slowly turning its blades in the faint breeze. Warm light glowed in the windows of some houses. Through powerful optics, they could make out people. Men, women, even a few children. They were engaged in the most ordinary evening activities. Someone was chopping wood by a shed, another carried water, someone else simply sat on a porch. There were no signs of a cult, ritual activity, fortifications, or visible weapons. just a normal farming community living a secluded life. Grayson kept his binoculars trained on the porch of one house for a long time. A woman sat there, slowly rocking a bundle in her arms, likely an infant. Her face, illuminated by the light from the window, looked tired but calm. An ordinary woman, an ordinary mother. He lowered the binoculars, feeling a sickening unease build inside him. The order was clear. Complete elimination of the site. Leave no witnesses. But the target before him didn't resemble a nest of dangerous fanatics staging ritual murders. These were families. Men, women, children. To give the order for their liquidation, without solid, irrefutable proof? Grayson looked at his men. The same bewilderment was mirrored on their faces. They were professionals, ready to follow any order, but this crossed a line. After a short, tense silence, Grayson made a decision. He couldn't initiate a massacre based solely on the words of a faceless agent and blurry photos. Fall back to temporary positions. Requesting confirmation from command, his voice was quiet but firm. He gestured to the comm specialist. The operator nodded and began setting up the equipment for a transmission. They needed to contact the base, Blade Command, report the situation, request additional intel, or a mission abort. Annihilating these people without confirming their guilt was unthinkable. At the exact moment, the comm specialist powered up the transmitter and prepared to send the encrypted message. Something strange happened. A soft yet distinct click emanated simultaneously from all the squad's electronic devices. The radio fell silent. GPS navigator screens went black. The night vision gear, just moments before displaying heat signatures from the ranch, cut out, plunging the operators into near total darkness, alleviated only by the faint starlight. A second of bewildered silence hung in the air. Then one of the operators cursed under his breath. Attempts to reboot the equipment were futile. All electronics were dead, as if hit by a powerful electromagnetic pulse. And almost simultaneously, fog began to descend from the surrounding forested slopes. It was unnaturally thick, dense, white as milk. It moved with astonishing speed, swallowing trees, hills, and then the ranch itself, obscuring it from view. Within minutes, the fog enveloped the Blade Squad's position, reducing visibility to mere yards. The comm specialist's attempts to use backup channels and emergency transmitters proved useless. The airwaves were dead, complete silence. They were cut off, isolated as if sealed off from the outside world. Grayson clenched his fists. And this fog, it was strange. It didn't dissipate, despite a light breeze. It seemed to press against their eardrums, causing an unpleasant clogged sensation. Some operators experienced mild nausea, others a throbbing headache. The silence, broken only by their own breathing and the muffled sounds of their comrades' movements, felt oppressively unnatural. The fog enveloped them, disorienting, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien, hostile space. Grayson issued an order. Move out, back the way we came. Strictly by compass, 5-yard interval. Maintain visual contact. They had to get out of this dead zone, out of the fog, reach the extraction point where the helicopters were supposed to be waiting, even if comms were down. The compass, the only thing still functioning in this chaos. The squad began to move, slowly and cautiously picking their way through the dense white shroud. Step by step, checking the small, trembling needle, they headed east, back the way they had come. They covered the estimated distance. several miles that should have taken them out of the valley toward the foothills where the LZ was located. The fog showed no signs of thinning. If anything, it seemed denser. Tension mounted. And then, ahead, familiar shapes began to emerge through the white haze. A wooden fence. Beyond it, the silhouette of a house, a barn. It was the ranch, the same ranch they had just been moving away from. But they had approached it from a completely different direction, opposite to where their observation post had been. Confusion rippled through the squad. "Captain, this... how the hell did this happen?" One of the assault troopers muttered, rubbing his eyes as if trying to dispel an illusion. Grayson couldn't believe his eyes either. A navigation error? But the compass was working, and they had maintained a strict azimuth. He remained silent, suppressing his own bewilderment. "Check the perimeter. Find another route. We head north," he ordered. Again, movement through the fog. Now they headed north, meticulously counting paces, constantly checking the compass. The fog seemed endless, monotonous, swallowing sound and time. It created a sense of confinement, claustrophobia under the open sky. The operators marched in silence, each lost in thought, battling rising anxiety. An hour passed. 2. Enough distance covered to be far from the ranch. But ahead, once again, the familiar fence began to materialize from the fog, and the silhouettes of the houses behind it. They had returned to the same ranch, again from another unexpected direction. This time, the silence was broken by a nervous chuckle from one of the operators, quickly morphing into a choked curse. Panic began to creep, slowly but inexorably, through the ranks of hardened professionals. This wasn't just strange. It was wrong, impossible. A third attempt. Now they moved south, doubling their caution, marking trees with slashes, when the fog graciously allowed them to see the trunks up close. The march was long and exhausting. The fog didn't yield an inch. And again, after covering enough ground to be far from the cursed place, they ran into the familiar fence. The same ranch. The same houses. As if an invisible wall kept forcing them back. After the third failed attempt to break out, there was no room left for doubt. Grayson and his lead tech, the navigation and electronics specialist, exchanged heavy glances. They were trapped in some kind of anomalous zone, a loop that constantly returned them to the starting point, the ranch. Every direction led back here. It was as if the rest of the landscape, the entire world beyond this foggy curtain, had simply ceased to exist, or was constantly rearranging itself, mocking them. This went beyond any combat experience, any rational logic. Supernatural? Grayson pushed the thought away. Panic was the worst enemy now. Maintain composure, look for a logical explanation even if there isn't one. But doubt had already taken root in the souls of his men. Forced once more to take up observation positions near the ranch's perimeter, hidden within the fog, they noticed changes. Using binoculars, and thanks to the fog being slightly less dense over the ranch itself compared to the woods, allowing for a bit more visibility, the squad could again observe the inhabitants. They were behaving differently now. Their movements were sharper, jerkier, like puppets on strings. The faces that had previously seemed ordinary were now devoid of emotion, frozen masks. They were no longer tending to their chores. They stood in groups or alone, staring motionlessly into the fog, as if waiting for something. Their earlier calm had been replaced by a tense, sinister anticipation. Watching these altered figures evoked even greater dread than the spatial trap itself. The thick fog beyond the ranch provided unreliable but necessary cover. The Blade Squad, retreating from the main cluster of ranch buildings, found temporary refuge in a dilapidated, abandoned barn on the very edge of the cursed territory. The planks were rotten, the roof gaped open in places, but the walls still offered some measure of protection and a chance to catch their breath. Through cracks in the walls and the wide, warped barn doors, the operators kept watch on the settlement's center, trying to remain unseen. What they witnessed next froze the blood in the veins of even the most seasoned veterans. The ranch inhabitants, every last one, men, women, even the few children they'd seen earlier, began to gather in the central clearing in front of the largest house. They moved slowly, synchronously, their empty eyes fixed on a point straight ahead. And then, in complete silence, broken only by the whistle of wind through the barn's gaps, the transformation began. It was an abominable, unnatural spectacle. Their bodies started to contort, bending at impossible angles. Bones snapped audibly, joints dislocated, limbs elongated or shortened grotesquely, skin shifted in color and texture, rippling into folds or stretching taut. Hair grew or vanished in seconds. Facial features warped, flowed like wax, rearranging themselves. Even their clothing seemed to morph, transforming along with their bodies. But the most terrifying part wasn't the metamorphosis itself. It was what they were becoming. Their distorted faces resolved into exact, yet monstrous, grotesque copies of the faces of the Blade operators. One former inhabitant now looked like a nightmarish reflection of Grayson himself, possessing his features but with dead eyes and a mouth stretched into a horrifying rictus. Others took on the likenesses of the snipers, the assault troopers, the medic, the tech, every member of the squad. Even their clothes, altered along with their bodies, were now precise replicas of the Blade team's uniforms and gear. Before the operators could recover from the shock, these creatures, these mimics mirroring their appearance, launched their attack. They moved with inhuman speed and strength, their movements jerky, predatory, yet they employed tactics chillingly familiar to the squad. They flanked, used cover, advanced with coordination. It was as if they knew all their standard maneuvers, all their protocols, and they screamed in the voices of the Blade operators. But these weren't just screams. They were fractured memories, the deepest-seated fears, shouted in distorted, mocking tones. "Why didn't you save her, Grayson, Dad?" "I don't want to. Please don't hit me. Mom, don't drink. They're all going to die because of you." A fierce, chaotic firefight erupted. The fog, poor visibility, the psychological shock, everything coalesced into a hellish cauldron. Operators fired at figures that looked like their comrades, like distorted reflections in a funhouse mirror. The enemies pressed the attack. The real cries of wounded men mingled with the mimics' horrific, parodied shrieks, creating a cacophony of terror and madness. In this turmoil, with visibility down to a few yards, tragedy struck. One of the assault troopers, Michael, spotted a figure in the fog, a spitting image of himself. The figure was rapidly closing on the squad medic, who was trying to drag a wounded comrade to cover. Believing it was a mimic about to attack the medic, Michael didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired a long burst. The figure jerked and collapsed. Michael ran forward, ready to finish the creature off, but what he saw made him scream in horror. Lying on the ground was not a mimic. It was Kirk, his partner, his friend. He had simply been trying to change position, fall back through the fog, and had stumbled into Michael's line of fire. Or had it been a mimic after all, assuming Kirk's form in its dying moments to sow even greater chaos and discord? Michael stared at the body, at the familiar face twisted in a death agony, unable to comprehend. His mind refused to accept the reality. The loss of a comrade at the hands of their own, the clash with an enemy that was their exact yet twisted reflection, an enemy that knew their fears and weaknesses. It shattered the squad's morale. Panic, previously held in check by discipline and experience, burst forth. Fall back, fall back. Grayson's command was lost in the din of battle and the mimic's screams. The squad, losing formation and coordination, began a disordered retreat deeper into the fog, trying to shake their pursuers, find new, more secure cover. Trust within the group was broken. Now every man looked at his brother-in-arms with suspicion. Who was he really? Was one of those mimics hiding behind a familiar face, waiting for its moment? The chaos of the retreat gave way to a heavy, tense lull. The remaining squad members found temporary refuge in the cellar of one of the outlying, semi-abandoned ranch houses. Kirk's death weighed heavily on everyone. Paranoia hung thick in the cellar's stale air. The operators avoided eye contact, each suspecting the man next to him might be a hidden enemy. Grayson knew that wandering further into the fog or passively waiting for death was not an option. The answers, however horrifying, had to be found here, on this damned ranch. Despite the lethal danger posed by the mimics, who could be lurking anywhere, he decided to scout the central part of the settlement. Perhaps, while the creatures were dispersed after the fight, they'd have a chance to find some clues. Leaving the bulk of the group in the cellar, Grayson took 3 of his most experienced men, the tech, the medic, and one of the snipers, and ventured back out. The fog still shrouded everything, but it seemed slightly less dense near the buildings. Moving cautiously, covering each other, they slipped into one of the houses. Inside, disorder reigned, but there were no signs of a struggle. However, in one room they stumbled upon strange equipment. Metal tables, IV stands, empty ampules with illegible labels scattered on the floor. It resembled an improvised medical station or laboratory. In another house, one that looked like a standard farmhouse, they found a child's room. Toys littered the floor, but drawings on the walls and a table caught their attention. They depicted ordinary people transforming into grotesque, terrifying creatures, some vaguely resembling animals, others simply nightmarish figures. And alongside these creatures, the drawings often featured figures in military uniforms. Their tech, constantly sweeping the area with a handheld scanner, one of the few devices still weakly functioning near the ranch center, picking up residual energy signatures, suddenly stopped near an old, boarded-up well in the main farmhouse's yard. The scanner showed anomalous readings, indicating complex electronics or an energy source underground. Examining the well and the adjacent house cellar more closely, they found it, a meticulously camouflaged entrance. A heavy metal door hidden behind a false wall in the cellar. It wouldn't yield to brute force, but the squad's tech, using his tools and skills, managed to bypass the electronic lock. which was apparently running on an independent power source. Descending a narrow metal staircase, they entered another world entirely. The contrast with the dilapidated wooden structures above was stark. They were in a modern, well-equipped underground laboratory. Bright fluorescent lights assaulted eyes accustomed to the dim world outside. White, sterile walls, rows of complex equipment, computers, monitors. Along one wall stretched rows of cages made of thick glass and steel. All were empty, but dark stains and scratches marred the floors of some. In the center stood operating tables, their metal surfaces bearing the marks of restraints and dried blood spatter. Refrigeration units held containers of biomaterials marked with complex codes. The air was heavy, smelling of antiseptic and something else, a faint, nauseating undertone of fear and pain. While the others took in the surroundings, Grayson approached one of the computer terminals. Its screen glowed. It seemed to be shielded from the external EMP that had disabled their gear. He managed to bypass the security. The passwords were surprisingly simple, standard for such facilities. He gained access to the files. Video logs showed other groups of soldiers, wearing different uniforms, possibly operators from other PMCs or even regular military units, undergoing similar trials on this very ranch. They too wandered lost in the fog, encountered monstrous transformations, killed each other. Experiment logs found in text files described the process of administering a modified retrovirus, designated lycanthropy vector, to soldiers during their service. It was done covertly, disguised as standard vaccinations, vitamin regimens, or experimental performance enhancers. The project's official objective, stated in early documents, the creation of biologically based adaptive camouflage and the development of a new psychological warfare weapon capable of mimicking the enemy and exploiting their fears. And then Grayson found the folder labeled Squad Blade. Inside were dossiers on every one of them. Their photos, service records, medical charts, and beside each name a notation, LV Carrier. Status, inactive. The horrifying truth crashed down on him with its full, monstrous weight. The ranch wasn't their mission objective. It was a trigger zone, a testing ground designed to activate the virus. The fog wasn't a weather phenomenon, but an aerosolized chemical or biological catalyst, meant to initiate the viral program within their bodies under conditions of extreme stress. The entire area around the ranch was subject to some kind of spatial anomaly, creating the loop and preventing escape. And this anomaly, according to the logs, was generated by something called the artifact, hidden here to ensure the complete activation phase. They weren't hunters. They were lab rats. And the ranch, with its surrounding territory, was their cage, their open-air laboratory. The return of Grayson and his small team to the cellar where the others huddled was silent and grim. The faces of those who had seen the lab were ashen. Grayson gathered the remaining survivors of Blade Squad, their numbers significantly thinned after the clash with the mimics. He told them everything. About the lab beneath the ground, about the video logs of other squads, about the lycanthrope vector retrovirus administered to them disguised as shots, about the ranch being a testing ground, the fog a catalyst, and they themselves the subjects of a monstrous experiment. He told them about the spatial loop generated by an artifact, and how their mission had been a lie from the start, a cover for activating the virus in their blood. The reaction was predictable, yet no less devastating. First, shock. The operators stared at Grayson, at their comrades, eyes wide, unable to process what they'd heard. Then came denial. "That's bullshit, Captain. It can't be. They wouldn't do this to us," some shouted. Others remained silent, but clenched fists and taut jaw muscles spoke of the storm raging within. Anger surged, mingling with fear and despair. Anger at those who sent them here, who used them as expendable assets. Fear of the unknown, of what would happen to them now. Despair at the realization they were trapped, cut off from the outside world, with no clear path to salvation. Some refused to believe until the very end, clinging to shreds of rational thought, trying to find another explanation. And as if to confirm the terrible truth, the catalyst, the fog, and the stress they'd endured began to take their toll. The first signs of transformation started appearing among the operators, subtly at first, then more overtly. Hearing sharpened to an extreme degree, catching faint script sounds, distant noises previously beyond human range. Vision in the dim cellar light and the enveloping fog became unnaturally acute, almost predatory. Minor cuts and scrapes from the fight with the mimics healed with astonishing speed, visibly closing before their eyes. But there were other, more disturbing symptoms. Flashes of uncontrollable rage seized one man, then another, over the smallest provocations. Brief memory lapses. A man would suddenly freeze, confused about where he was, or what he'd just been doing. Muscles cramped, tremors ran through their bodies. The virus was beginning its work. The psychological assault from the mimics hadn't stopped. They weren't launching physical attacks, but their presence was felt everywhere. Their voices drifted from the fog, perfect copies of the operators' voices, but distorted, mocking. They whispered accusations, reminded them of past failures, fallen comrades, pressed on guilt, especially Michael's, still tormented by Kirk's death. They preyed on the deepest fears, trying to provoke further stress, amplify paranoia, and accelerate the transformation process. The mimics weren't just a physical threat. They were instruments of torture, designed to break their minds. Grayson replayed the information from the lab logs in his head again and again. He started to ponder the true purpose of this diabolical trial. Clearly, it wasn't just about activating the virus. Perhaps the goal was a test of control. Could soldiers, with their specialized training and iron discipline, maintain their sanity, loyalty, and self-control after the ancient primal instincts embedded in the virus began to awaken? Or would the beast within take over? The ranch was a crucible, ruthlessly separating the successful specimens, those who could control the transformation and their newfound power, from the failures, those who would succumb to madness and rage. Confirmation of this theory wasn't long in coming. Michael, the assault trooper, broken by guilt over Kirk's death and tormented by the mimics' voices, was the first to cross the line. His transformation was rapid and radical. His eyes suddenly blazed with a yellow animalistic fire. A low, menacing growl ripped from his throat. He leaped to his feet, his face contorted into a mask of inhuman fury. Blaming everyone around him for betrayal and for Kirk's death, succumbing to paranoia and primal aggression, he lunged at the nearest operator, claws bared. The reaction from the others was instantaneous. He had to be neutralized, hard, lethally. The silence that fell after the brief, brutal struggle was deafening. They had killed another of their own. Not by accident this time, because he had become a werewolf before their very eyes. The realization of the monster within became terrifyingly real. Now each squad member feared not only the mimics outside or the spatial trap. Now each feared himself, the beast dormant in his blood, waiting only for its moment to break free. The revelation about the virus and Michael's subsequent tragic transformation marked the point of no return. The fragile unity of the Blade Squad, held together by discipline and a common enemy, finally shattered. The group fractured into two irreconcilable camps. The first, smaller faction rallied around Grayson. These operators, shaken by events and horrified by what they were becoming, resolved to fight back, to fight the transformation, to try and preserve what remained of their humanity, to suppress the awakening beast within. Their primary goal became finding a way to destroy the artifact, the source of the spatial anomaly, to break the loop and gain a chance to escape this hellish trap. They believed this was the only way to save themselves, not just physically, but morally. The second, larger group chose a different path. Its de facto leader became Grayson's second-in-command, Sergeant Riggs, a pragmatic, hardened operator. His eyes had changed, now burning with a yellow light. His movements grew sharper, his voice taking on growling undertones. These men decided to embrace the new power granted by the virus. They saw it not as a curse, but as evolution, a chance to become something more than human. A way to survive this nightmare and, if they ever got out, to exact vengeance on those who had condemned them to this fate. They didn't transform instantly like Michael. Instead, they stopped resisting the changes, actively yielding to their instincts. Their appearances gradually shifted, becoming more bestial. Features coarsened, fangs elongated, claws grew on their hands. The ranch grounds, shrouded in dense fog, became an arena for a brutal hunt. Former comrades who had recently fought shoulder to shoulder now stalked and killed one another. A merciless game of cat and mouse began, where every rustle could signal deadly danger. The lines were blurred. Yesterday's friend, the one you shared rations with and covered in a firefight, could transform in the next instant into a snarling monster thirsting for your blood. The fighting became incredibly savage. Firearms were still used, but increasingly, fangs and claws decided the outcome. Clashes devolved into furious, bloody duels where human tactics mingled with animalistic ferocity. The fog concealed hunters and prey alike, turning every step into a lethal gamble. Riggs's group, having embraced their new nature, encountered the remaining mimics. The former ranch inhabitants transformed into nightmarish copies of the Blade operators. Initially, Riggs and his followers attempted communication, perhaps even an alliance, seeing them as fellow transformed beings, other victims of the experiment. But the mimics were incapable of dialogue or cooperation. They were merely programmed shells, driven by primal aggression and embedded commands. They attacked Riggs's group as ferociously as they had Grayson's men. The response from the transformed operators was swift and brutal. Using their enhanced strength, speed, and predatory instincts, Riggs's pack quickly hunted down and annihilated nearly all the remaining mimics. This easy victory over the ranch's grotesque creations further solidified their conviction that lycanthropy was a gift, not a curse, and that this power was meant for dominance and survival. Now both factions, Grayson's men struggling to remain human, and Riggs's werewolves embracing the beast within, pursued the same objective: reach the underground laboratory. For Grayson, the lab held the key to understanding and possibly destroying the artifact. For Riggs and his pack, the lab might contain information on controlling and enhancing their new abilities, and potentially grant access to the artifact itself, which they could perhaps harness if they understood its workings. The struggle for control of the bunker became the central conflict on the ranch. Grayson and his few remaining loyalists found themselves in a horrifying predicament. They understood that it wasn't just the virus turning them into monsters, but the situation itself, forcing them to kill their own kind to survive. Their moral compass was spinning wildly. The lines between good and evil, human and beast, blurred into the bloody fog of the ranch. The objective was clear: the artifact. Grayson had studied the data copied from the lab terminal during their first foray. Schematics and technical descriptions pinpointed the device's location, the lowest, most secure level of the underground bunker. It was their only hope of shattering the spatial loop and escaping this hell. Gathering his remaining loyal operators, no more than 5, wounded, exhausted, but not yet broken, Grayson led them toward the camouflaged entrance to the lab. The path was perilous. Riggs's group, now almost entirely composed of partially or fully transformed werewolves, was also converging on the bunker, determined to seize it first. The push toward the lab became a series of short, vicious skirmishes in the fog. Grayson's team, using tactical advantages, knowledge of the terrain, and remnants of human cunning, managed to avoid a direct confrontation with Riggs's main force. They were forced to neutralize a few former comrades blocking their path, but they moved quickly, cohesively. Luck was with them. They reached the concealed entrance in the farmhouse cellar first. The tech swiftly bypassed the lock, and Grayson's team slipped inside, hastily barricading the heavy metal door behind them as best they could. They had bought themselves some time, but the sounds of snarling and heavy impacts on the door were already audible from outside. Riggs's werewolves were close behind. Descending to the lowest level of the lab, where the schematics indicated the artifact resided, they froze. The chamber was bathed in a steady, cold light. In the center, indeed, rested something that could only be the artifact. A complex assembly of interwoven metal hoops, crystals pulsing with bluish light, and integrated high-tech components of clearly non-human origin. But it wasn't the device that commanded their attention. Standing near the artifact, his back to them, was a figure. He turned slowly at the sound of their footsteps. It was the agent, the same mysterious figure who had briefed Grayson in the sterile, windowless room. The shadows no longer concealed his face. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged man in a severe dark suit, but his eyes held an icy calm and faint curiosity. He wasn't surprised by their arrival. He had clearly been monitoring everything through hidden cameras, which Grayson now realized must infest the entire lab and ranch grounds. "Captain Grayson, I expected you would make it this far." The most resilient specimens always reach the finale. The agent's voice was normal now, human, devoid of any modulator. His calm, even tone was jarringly dissonant with the surroundings, and the fact that maddened werewolves were battering the door outside. The agent stepped away from the artifact, as if inviting them closer. "You're looking for a way to deactivate the field, aren't you? To break the loop?" He offered a slight, humorless smile. "It's quite simple, Captain. The artifact feeds on energy, life force, the psychic emanations of a sentient being. To deactivate it, or rather to satisfy it and compel it to collapse the anomaly, requires a voluntary integration, the final phase of the protocol. He looked directly at Grayson. A sentient being must allow the artifact to absorb it, completely, consciously. It's the only way to neutralize it and conclude the operation. Otherwise, you'll all remain here forever until you kill each other or lose your minds. At that precise moment, the heavy door to the sector failed. With a deafening screech of tortured metal, it was ripped from its hinges. The figures of fully transformed operators from Riggs's pack filled the breach. Their eyes burned with fury, saliva dripped from their maws, claws flexed, ready to rend flesh. They saw Grayson and his men near the artifact and charged forward with a roar, clearly intending to seize the device for themselves or simply destroy those who still clung to their humanity. The final, desperate battle ignited within the laboratory walls. Grayson's men opened fire, trying to stem the tide of monsters superior in strength and ferocity. Bullets ricocheted off the thick hides of some werewolves or only momentarily slowed them. Operators fell one by one, torn apart by claws and teeth. Grayson watched his last loyal men die, defending him, defending the ghost of a chance for salvation. He fired, changed position, but knew it was over. They were too few, the enemy too strong. There was no other way. The agent remained off to the side near the wall, observing the carnage with cold, almost clinical interest, like a spectator at a gladiatorial match. Grayson made his decision. The only one left, fall back. To the exit. If it opens, get out. Grayson's command cut through the werewolves' roars and the gunfire. The two remaining survivors of his team, the medic and the sniper, froze for a second, disbelieving, but the captain's direct order and the desperation in his eyes spurred them into action. Covering each other, they began a slow withdrawal toward the mangled doorway through which Riggs's pack had burst. Grayson himself, ignoring the monsters now closing in on him, spun and lunged toward the artifact, pulsing with blue light. He felt the heat of a werewolf's breath on his back, heard the whistle of claws slicing through the air. But he made it. His hand touched the cold, vibrating surface of one of the crystalline components. Instantly, the artifact erupted in blinding white light, flooding the laboratory. An energy wave blasted outwards, throwing back both the attacking werewolves and the retreating humans. Grayson felt an unbearable agony lance through him, as if every cell in his body was being torn apart. But the physical pain was accompanied by another sensation, his consciousness rapidly expanding, stretching, as if his mind was being plugged into something vast, ancient. He had expected instant death, annihilation, but instead, a torrent of information, visions, knowledge flooded his fading awareness, transmitted directly from the artifact. This wasn't just a government experiment to create super soldiers. What he saw were echoes of an ancient ritual, repeated over centuries, millennia. Werewolves, lycanthropes. They weren't products of genetic engineering or random mutation. They were an ancient race, predatory, powerful, existing on Earth long before humankind. A race capable of shape-shifting, possessing incredible strength, regeneration, and a connection to primal natural forces. They had ruled the world from the shadows, hiding, manipulating, sometimes falling dormant for entire epochs. The artifact wasn't merely an anomaly generator. It was a key, a resonator, a device to awaken and amplify their power, to activate the ancient blood in the descendants of those who carried their genes, having mingled with humans ages ago. Experiments like the one at the ranch weren't scientific research. They were ritualistic selections, ways to awaken the dormant heritage in carefully chosen candidates. Soldiers, police, individuals accustomed to violence and capable of enduring the transformation, and to elevate the worthy among them, those who could control the beast within. And then Grayson understood the final, most terrifying truth. The agent, calmly observing from the sidelines, wasn't human. His composure, his cold interest, his knowledge of the ritual, it all pointed to one thing. He was one of them, one of those ancient werewolves, perhaps holding a high rank in their hierarchy. His task wasn't to test soldiers for some government agency. His task was to conduct this brutal ritual selection, weed out the weak, identify the strong, and crucially procure a voluntary, conscious sacrifice for the artifact, the sacrifice of a strong-willed human resisting the transformation, to complete the current stage of their grand plan, the resurgence of their race and the consolidation of its power over the world. Grayson's sacrifice, his consciousness and life force absorbed by the artifact, satisfied the ancient mechanism. The device flared one last time, overloading on the influx of energy. The spatial loop holding everyone captive on the ranch began to collapse. The laboratory walls trembled, dust and concrete raining from the ceiling. Outside the bunker, the fog started to dissipate rapidly, as if being sucked back into the earth. Grayson himself ceased to exist as a physical entity. His form dissolved in the flash of light, disintegrated into myriad shimmering particles absorbed by the dying artifact. He was gone, dead. But his sacrifice wasn't in vain. The trap was breaking. In the ensuing chaos, the agent, an expression of profound satisfaction on his face, stepped toward a section of the lab wall that slid aside, revealing a secret passage. He cast a final glance at the crumbling artifact and the werewolves fighting in their death throes, then disappeared into the tunnel. His mission was accomplished. The remaining transformed members of Riggs's pack still in the lab either died under the collapsing debris as the artifact imploded, or, driven mad by pain and the fear of destruction, tried to flee through the main entrance, trampling each other in panic. Their ultimate fate remained unknown. The tremors beneath their feet intensified. The lab was coming down. The medic and the sniper, the last survivors of Grayson's team, stunned by their captain's sacrifice and the sudden collapse of the spatial loop, instinctively bolted for the exit. They scrambled out of the farmhouse cellar just as the ground beneath them gave a violent heave, followed by the roar of collapsing rock behind them. The fog, so recently an impenetrable wall, was almost entirely gone, leaving only a light haze clinging to the ground, rapidly fading in the pre-dawn twilight. The energy pulse from the collapsing artifact slammed into them, and they lost consciousness. Sometime later, they awoke. Looking around, they saw the ranch now looked disturbingly ordinary. A few dilapidated houses, a barn, a broken windmill. A quiet, abandoned place, as if nothing had ever happened here, as if the entire nightmare had been a hallucination brought on by the fog. They fled the ranch, not looking back, driven by adrenaline and the horror of their ordeal. They walked for hours until they stumbled onto an old, cracked asphalt road. Their strength was nearly gone. On the shoulder, half hidden in the brush, sat an abandoned pickup truck with shattered windows and flat tires. The keys were missing, of course, but the sniper, who'd been a mechanic before joining the PMC, managed to hotwire the engine. The truck sputtered and coughed, but it ran. They drove down the road, destination unknown, just away from the cursed place. After a couple dozen miles, they reached a small, sleepy town. A few streets, a gas station, a general store, a sheriff's office. The world around them looked utterly normal. The morning sun shone, birds sang, a few locals went about their business. Everything seemed ordinary. They stopped at the store for water and something to eat. As they paid, the local sheriff approached them. A large man with a tired face and a badge pinned to his chest. He asked a few standard questions: who they were, where they were from, what brought them to his town. He spoke amicably enough, but his smile seemed too wide to the medic, predatory. And for a fleeting moment, a strange yellowish glint flickered in his eyes, unsettlingly similar to what they'd seen in Michael before his final violent outburst. They made hasty farewells and drove off. In the truck, they turned on the radio. A news announcer spoke cheerfully about the ongoing consolidation of power and the merger of several major corporations under the umbrella of a single mega-corporation. Helios International, which now controlled a significant portion of the economy and media. Wait, the name felt strangely familiar. They pulled over near an electronics store. On a television screen in the window, they saw the corporation's logo, a stylized sun with a wolf's head at its center. The symbol looked vaguely familiar, like markings they'd seen on equipment in the underground lab. The people on the town streets, upon closer inspection, also seemed different. Tenser, more aggressive. There was something animalistic in their gazes, their postures, and then it hit them. The realization struck like a blow to the gut. These people, werewolves, they were all werewolves. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. In the truck, they found an old newspaper wedged beneath the seat. The date on the front page made their blood run cold. 3 years had passed. By their reckoning, only a couple of days had gone by since the insertion near the ranch. How was that possible? Was the spatial loop tied to time as well? Had they been thrown into the future? Or had the world changed so drastically in the few days they spent trapped in hell? There were more questions than answers. They didn't understand how they'd ended up here, why years had vanished, why the world was now openly ruled by werewolves. They weren't just existing. They had been here all along, integrated into society, holding key positions in government, business, law enforcement, pulling the strings, running the world. The medic and the sniper stood on the shoulder of the dusty road watching cars drive past. The world moved on, but for them, it had become alien and hostile. The enemy was everywhere. In the sheriff's office, on the TV news, in the eyes of random passers-by. Who could they trust? Was anyone else left who knew the truth? Could they even fight back? And the final, most terrifying question: hadn't their own transformation simply been delayed? Had they themselves become the very thing they were supposed to fight? They looked at each other, and in his comrade's eyes, each saw not only fear and confusion, but also that same, barely perceptible predatory glint. Their war was already lost.